Hi, my name is Sean McIntosh, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today for this webinar on the impact of hybrid cloud environments on Microsoft licensing. Lines will be muted during the webcast, and questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation. If you have any questions, please submit them via the question chat console, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for encore viewing at method180.com. We will also follow up and send you an email with links to the recording, slides, and any special offers following the webinar. Our speaker today is Mike Austin. Mike leads the service delivery team at Method 180 and has successfully negotiated over $1 billion in Microsoft contracts over his career. He spent over a decade working at Microsoft in licensing-related roles and has extensive experiences with best practices for licensing cost reduction. I'm going to turn things over to Mike to get the presentation started.
Great, thanks, Sean. Good afternoon, everybody. And so for those of you that have been to one of our webinars in the past, I apologize. I'll just do a little bit of the quick commercial before we dive into it. But Sean kind of went through this a little bit, but Method 180 is an organization that is made up primarily ex-Microsoft people that helps organizations either negotiate more effective agreements with Microsoft, or we also do audit defense, or if you're in a SAM engagement with Microsoft, we help organizations defend themselves through those sorts of agreements. But today we're here to talk about cloud implementations, hybrid cloud, and what the impact is from a Microsoft licensing perspective. And so what I wanted to do is level set and kind of set the stage and try and put you inside the mind of a Microsoft rep a little bit before we get into this, so that you maybe understand some of the motivation if they are, if you are talking about moving to Azure or AWS or a third-party data center, what is Microsoft thinking? Why are they saying certain things to you? Why are they positioning things a certain way? And then maybe demystify, I think is probably the best word to use, some of the realities of when it comes to the cloud. Now, the one thing that I will say is this is a very complicated topic. As I was putting this together today, putting together the presentation for this afternoon, I actually think we'll probably end up having a couple of follow-up sessions around cloud and cloud licensing and the impact on them, because it's just a lot to cover even in an hour-long session. But I am going to try and set the stage today. I think you're going to come away with some maybe ahas out of this, hopefully, and that is the goal, but also to give you an understanding of, it is complex, so if you are confused, you shouldn't feel bad about that. It isn't, this is not straightforward licensing. And, I also want to help you understand how you should start looking at this from the perspective of, what's the impact on licensing? Should I move my current licenses to the cloud? Should I buy them in some other way? And what does that look like? But I think what really is important to understand is that Microsoft thinks of cloud in three ways. And this may be different than kind of, I'll call it the broader market thinks of cloud. This is probably just a subset of what, cloud is when you hear it. But they really think of it as two ways. They think of it as infrastructure as a service. So in other words, using a cloud provider to supplement on-premise infrastructure. And so, they really think of infrastructure as a service as maybe a way to offload development cycles into the Azure cloud, but leave most of your development environment still on-premise. So it really is just the infrastructure as a service. They also talk about platform as a service. Now, Microsoft really, for the most part, although they'll talk about this, again, they probably just provide the infrastructure for this, but platform as a service to them is building out a whole new application that does not involve any on-premise infrastructure at all. So they would do PaaS services, for instance, if you were doing Azure in the cloud, SharePoint in the Azure cloud or in AWS or something to that effect. But, Microsoft itself, their offerings here are all about providing the plumbing, so to speak. And then the third one that they think of, which is, we're not really going to talk about this one today. I've done other talks on this in the past, and you can check those out on our YouTube channel if you want to go back and see those, but it's software as a service. And so that's the use of a workload or an application entirely in the cloud. And probably the most common way to think about this is the Office 365 stack to Microsoft. So this is running Exchange in the cloud, could be running SharePoint in the cloud, or Skype or Lync in the cloud. So this is really about running an entire application itself in somebody's cloud data center. Now, there's always the hybrid aspects of this. You know, what happens if you can't take everything to the cloud and you still have some on-premise in the cloud? But they really think of SaaS in terms of that Office 365 space. And so, you know, when you're talking to Microsoft, it's important that if you say cloud, you kind of try and think, you know, what does cloud mean to me, and how do I relate it back to Microsoft in this way? Because, you know, they may take, if you say I'm moving stuff to the cloud, they may think, okay, you're going to do infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. So I can sell you Azure, I can sell you Office 365, I can sell you all this stuff. And so you really want to be clear with them. Cloud means this to me. It means that I'm going to move Exchange to the cloud, or I want to move my SQL development environment to a cloud platform, so that they understand, you know, what it is that you're looking at. Now, one of the questions that I get asked quite often is, and we're going to dive into this in depth here this afternoon, but I want to set the stage on why licensing becomes complicated in these cloud environments. And so there are scenarios that you can use your own licenses. So if I've got licenses on an EA or through Select or through an open program, there are scenarios where you can use your own licenses in a cloud environment. And we'll talk about what those are. But I think one of the key concepts are when you buy licenses through these programs, again, the EA, Select, MPSA, Open, those are what are defined, or what Microsoft refers to as volume licenses, or you'll see the acronym VL, okay? And I'm going to refer to that throughout this afternoon. You'll see me talking about VL, or volume licenses. And so if I do say that, just kind of remember that that means licenses that are bought through one of these commercial programs like the EA or Select program, okay? Now, the EA and Select agreements and even open licenses are governed by a document that Microsoft publishes called the product terms. Now, it was called the product use rights. They changed that 5-6 months ago to a document called the product terms. And within the product terms is this restriction that I've put here, where it says that the use of the product cannot be used to offer commercial hosting services to third parties. So in other words, if commercial hosting is going on, my volume licenses that I bought through my EA or Select cannot be used unless there's an exception to that. We're going to talk about the exceptions, but in theory, why this matters is if you're moving stuff to the cloud, the product terms stop you from being able to use your volume licenses, aka your EA licenses, in the cloud. Now, software assurance changes that. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes, but for the most part, just kind of think, I'm moving to the cloud, it's third-party hosting services, I can't use my volume licenses there, okay? Now, something else to think about throughout this presentation is, why is it that my Microsoft rep wants me to buy license mobility rights? So I guess the first thing I should talk about is, what are license mobility rights? So Microsoft, I can't remember if it was like 18, 24 months ago, it was a couple of years ago, let's say, introduced these things called license mobility rights into software assurance. So if I had a license that had software assurance, they made these license mobility rights. And if you've attended any of my other webinars, you've heard me talk about license mobility rights in terms of virtualization rules, where I can move the license from host 1 to host 2, and it can go with it, but Microsoft has this 90-day rule that does not allow me to move it back to host 1 for 90 days unless it has software assurance, and then I can move it back. And there's some restrictions there. I'm going to get into that too. But just think about license mobility as the rights to move my application, my Microsoft application, SharePoint, SQL, Exchange, BizTalk, you know, all the products, server products. It allows me to move them from host to host, and that also includes moving them into a third-party cloud environment, okay? And so your Microsoft rep is going to be pushing you to purchase license mobility rights through, I put your EA, because most people that attend these sessions are in organizations that have EA, but if you don't have an EA, they're going to push it through software assurance. And why is that? And it really boils down to, it's all about compensation, okay? And what do I mean by that? If you purchase volume licenses, regardless of the program, your Microsoft rep receives revenue credit for that. If you do not purchase through volume license, and you purchase the rights to use those licenses through a service provider, whether that service provider is Microsoft as Azure, whether it's AWS or whether it's a third-party data center like one of our favorite ones to use is a company called DataPipe, you are not, your Microsoft rep is not going to receive the revenue credit to retire their quota for those purchases through those third parties. That goes into a whole other group within Microsoft that gets that revenue credit. And so even though buying volume licenses for the cloud is something that you're going to be able to do, again, we'll talk about scenarios on how that happens here, it may or may not be the best thing for your company. And there's lots of things to consider. First and foremost is cost. I'm going to show you today that many times it's actually cheaper not to purchase the licenses through licensed mobility rights, and it's cheaper to purchase through other programs through the service provider. It's also going to depend on whether you own licenses today and whether those have software assurance. It may make a difference, and it does make a difference if when you move to the cloud, that's done in a dedicated hardware environment where the hardware itself is dedicated to you as an end consumer, or whether you're on hardware where there's multi-tenancy going on. It also depends on what the product is that's being hosted, because not all Microsoft products are created equal here. We're going to talk a lot about Windows servers because they are one that's not created equal here. And then it also is going to boil down to license management and complexity. It may be easier not to use your own licenses, because if you're going to have to take your licenses and provide them to a cloud provider for use there, there's a process that I have to go through. Talk about that in a bit. But there's also the fact that how do you deduct those licenses, so to speak, from your inventory and keep track of that so that you know those licenses are allocated for use at AWS or wherever you're using them. So I think the key message that I want you to kind of keep in the back of your mind today is Microsoft sales rep, your account rep wants you to buy this through them, through volume licenses, so they get quota. I'm here to tell you today that buying it through volume license may not be in your best interest, and I think in the vast majority of the time it probably is not. There are definitely scenarios where it does make sense, but we'll go through what those look like. Okay. So here's what happened prior to Microsoft launching these licensed mobility rights a couple of years ago. So you're going to see these diagrams kind of throughout my presentation this afternoon. I kind of actually borrowed these through the licensed mobility through Microsoft Software Assurance license brief that Microsoft has. So if you want to grab a copy of it, you can Google it and find it, or drop me an email at mike@method180 and I'll just send it to you. But it's a 15, 16-page document that kind of outlines a lot of these concepts. But really what happens is, if you're looking, again, prior to license mobility, there were two areas that you could use volume licenses for. Okay, so if I bought an Exchange server, I could run that on my hardware on premise. That one's pretty easy if it's dedicated. Now, there are some people on this call that may be doing things where they provide applications that are using SQL, so think of SQL as the app, where they're providing that data to their clients, which could be considered third-party hosting. And I'm not going to get into that today, but Microsoft is looking for this in environments today. So I'll take a couple of seconds and talk about it, but that in itself is a whole topic. So I have an application, I developed that application, I'm using the data or that application with my clients, and it's potentially that could be considered third-party hosting. So even though I'm not a service provider, I could be a third-party hoster and violating my EA rules by using these applications in that manner. So I'm just going to leave it there. If you have questions on that, feel free to reach out. But there are lots of cases where customers have developed an application, like a financial services data provider that's providing data in through SQL databases to their clients, and that's third-party hosting. So there's some special provisions that you need to make sure that you follow there. The other place that you could have done this is in, Microsoft in this diagram calls it the dedicated outsourcer here. But this, think about it as a dedicated third-party data center. So that could be a hoster like AWS, it could be Azure, it could be, one of these third-party data centers like I mentioned before. But that's where you have dedicated hardware. So the hardware is your own. There's nobody else on that physical box. It could be virtual, but there's nobody else on that physical box. Was dedicated, you were allowed to use your own licenses. And you don't need software assurance for this, and you can still do this today. So there's really no license mobility there. You could just say, I'm going to provide my licenses to my third-party data center provider for my Windows and SQL and Exchange or whatnot. Because that environment is dedicated to us, I can use my own licenses. For anybody else, where there are multi-tenant scenarios, so let's just say you go to AWS, you throw up an image on one of their servers, it's a virtual image, and there's multiple clients on there, that's multi-tenancy. And so that was not allowed at all. There was no licensing provisions for that through volume licensing because that's third-party hosting. And so what happens in those cases are the service provider has what's called a SPLA, or Service Provider License Agreement, with Microsoft, where they actually report your usage monthly to Microsoft, and they pay for those license or the use of that product within that SPLA agreement. So, in those contracts with those third parties, sometimes they'll call this out. Sometimes it's just included in your kind of monthly fee that you pay them for hardware and storage and bandwidth and all that good stuff. But in what they were doing is reporting usage to Microsoft of the number of Windows licenses or Exchange users or whatnot, and reporting that back. Now, they weren't necessarily reporting, and this is go back to why Microsoft reps don't like this, is a SPLA provider doesn't say ABC company is using these licenses. They just say, we have 500 clients, and our 500 clients are using a total of these number of licenses every month. So your rep doesn't get any revenue credit from it, and that's part of the reason that they don't like it when their enterprise or corporate customers purchase through these sort of agreements. So to summarize here, prior to license mobility, I can only use volume license on-premise or in an outsourcer or a third-party data center if the hardware was dedicated. Only, in other words, there was nobody else on that physical box. It was dedicated to my use. Okay. If it was a scenario where it was multi-tenant, where there were more than one customer with VMs on a physical server, regardless of the applications, that is third-party hosting, and the service provider would be purchasing licenses through a program called SPLA with Microsoft there. Now, like I said, I think it was about 2 years ago, Microsoft introduced a new software assurance benefit called license mobility. And, so what they did was they basically said, we're going to allow you to use your licenses in a third party if you have software assurance on it, right? And so their reason for that is that you could repurpose licenses that you owned and kind of use cloud technologies and move them, move your workloads out into the cloud. And so, they kind of positioned it as, hey, it's a great benefit that we're throwing in software assurance. I would kind of argue with them, why do I need SA to, properly license my servers? But, that's outside of my control. They basically said that in order to do this, to use your licenses in those third-party hosted scenarios where there's multi-tenant, we'll let you do that through license mobility as an SA benefit, and that means that you have to have software assurance on it, okay? So really what this means is with certain licenses, you can deploy those applications into a third-party data center. And when I speak of applications in this context, think of server licenses. Okay, I'm not referring today at all to Office or the desktop OS. I'm talking server products, Exchange, SharePoint, SQL, Windows, even System Center. Okay. Now, it is important to note, Windows servers was not included in this license mobility right at all. So even though I could move my SQL database or my SharePoint site or my Exchange server, the Windows Server license, I couldn't. I would have to have the data center provider or the service provider provide that to me. I couldn't take my Windows Server because they don't have license mobility rights. Now, the other thing to note is that there is a restriction that the application has to be dedicated to your organization. So, I can't really think of, somewhere where it wouldn't be in the Microsoft world. But I guess in theory it could be, I don't know, CRM. I put it in a third-party data center, but they just offer CRM services to anybody in a certain industry, and we're all on the same implementation. That's not allowed with your licenses. It's got to be dedicated to your use. But I can't really think where that would happen. But I'm sure that could potentially happen. The other thing that I always say is don't let the fact that it's an SA benefit fool you. It may not be cheaper, and we're going to talk about that here in a few minutes. So they announced the license mobility benefit. So how does it work? Again, on this chart, the stuff in blue is volume licenses, so licenses you as an organization acquire through your EA or Select, and purple are the licenses that the service provider would provide you. So the first two boxes here, going from left to right, stay the same. On-premise makes sense. I got on-premise servers. I would buy my volume licenses. Those are dedicated to me. Away we go. I can move them into a service provider's environment, including AWS. AWS does dedicated hardware. And I can use my licenses there. That's not a problem. Or you can see where with license mobility through SA, I can move those applications into the third-party data center, Azure, AWS, somebody like DataPipe, and I can use my licenses there. But you'll see the big box in purple down there below, the OS server, so the Windows Server licenses cannot be used. They don't have license mobility, so I can't move my own Windows Server licenses to my third-party data center in a shared hardware environment. So I'm going to have the option in those cloud environments to either use my own volume licenses for pretty much any server product except for Windows, or I can just purchase licenses that or I can let the service provider, provide those licenses through their SPLA agreement. Okay, and so I think the key concept to remember is license mobility allows me to move as long as I have active software assurance, but the Windows OS can't go, so I still have to account for the Windows OS. Okay, so a lot of the questions that I do get are around what applications qualify for license mobility. Okay, and so here are a few: SQL, Skype, Exchange. I've listed them here. And if you want to tell if a product actually qualifies for license mobility, what you do, and this is on the right-hand side, that screenshot that I have there, is you go into the product terms document, which if you just Google Microsoft product terms, it'll take you to the link. You can download it, find the product that you want. In section 4, under each product is software assurance, and it lists the SA benefits. So you can see here, the one that I've highlighted in yellow, license mobility is available for all editions except for developer and parallel data warehouse. Just as an FYI, this is from the SQL Server one. So license mobility is available for everything except for developer and parallel data warehouse. So standard and enterprise, and I can definitely do license mobility with as long as I have active software assurance. Okay. So if you went to see the Windows Server one, what Windows Server would say under license mobility is only the external connector. So an external connector is if you have non-employees accessing your Windows servers, that allows you to not purchase CALs for them. You can just buy an external connector and have unlimited people come in. That has server mobility, but the server license itself does not. Now, in February, so just a couple of months ago, Microsoft announced another SA benefit as part of Windows. It's an Azure benefit where you can move your Windows Server license to Azure as part of an SA benefit, but they do not allow you to move that to AWS or any other third party. Okay, so only to Azure will they let you take your Windows Server licenses. Now, when you really dissect this, I don't have a lot on this because it's really new. There's not actually even a lot out there. Microsoft just kind of publicly announced it and kind of buried it into the product terms. There's a whole section in the product terms around this. It's a few paragraphs long, but really what it boils down to is you can do one-to-one on standard, so I can move one VM with one standard license. If I have a data center license, I can only use 2, okay? So, it's not that great actually, because the data center licenses are typically the ones that you have your VMs on that would be moving to the cloud, and you're only allowed to use 2 VMs, not unlimited, so it's a little restrictive in that way. It's also important to note that if the server license is licensed in the server CAL model, in order to do license mobility, you require all the appropriate CALs to be licensed with software assurance as well. Okay, so that's important for SharePoint Server, Exchange, Dynamics, some very rare scenarios with SQL now, Skype for sure. So it's not just the server license you need to have SA on. If you're going to use license mobility, the CALs actually have to have licenses license with software assurance as well. Okay. So let's take a look at a real world example. And kind of, I know I've got some numbers on here and our eyes are probably going to try and go and read that chart on the right first, but if you can bear with me for a second, I'm going to walk you through this, and we'll talk about why you know, license mobility may not be in your best interest from a financial perspective. And then I'll talk about license management complexity after this, okay? So, you know, I've got a SQL server running 4 enterprise SQL virtual cores, and that sits on a Windows server. So it's a virtual SQL database sitting on a, I don't know, say an ESX host. So on the left is my volume license for on-premise. So if I look, I've got 2 SQL Enterprise 2 core packs with SA on that, and I have a 1 Windows server. Doesn't matter if it's standard data center because we didn't say how many VMs are on this. So I got a Windows server license for it. And so I want to move that into a cloud provider. Let's say that's AWS in this example. So I move that over. My 4 core licenses are, you know, have active SA, so I can move those licenses over. So on the right here, we got the service provider. So they're going to run those 4 SQL cores for me, same number of cores, and a virtual server. So what does that mean? If I look in this license mobility example, so the gray box down below that, I need 2 SQL Enterprise core licenses with license mobility that include SA. Check, I've got that. And I cannot move my Windows standard server because it doesn't have mobility. So even if it does have SA, I can't move it. So the service provider will need to provide me a license for 1 server VM through the service provider. They have a couple of different ways they can do that, but let's just assume they're going to provide you with a Windows server license, or they have to, okay? So let's take a look at what this costs. And I'm just using a new EA here, level A, assuming license and software assurance. So let's say I went out and I signed a new EA, and I'm just on the left. I've got my VM on the left. So I buy my 2 SQL licenses and my 1 Windows Server license, and you know, annually that's $13,625, or just shy of $41,000 for 3 years. And so 6 months later, we figure, you know what, let's move this to the cloud. We move this over to, doesn't matter, Amazon, AWS, Azure, DataPipe, you know, somebody like that. And what ends up happening is I now need to buy an incremental license, which is probably buried into my hardware cost and stuff. But, you know, there's a license cost there, which is about $15 a month for just a standard license, Windows standard license. And so that adds on about an extra $441. So now instead of being $40,875 because I can't take the Windows license, I'm now paying $41,316 for 3 years. About a 1% increase in price. So you may look at that and go, that's not all that bad, Mike. But what happens if, you know, we're looking at this longer term, and what happens if I was just to buy this through the service provider? So the service provider cost for this, for that SQL and for the Windows, is $33,000 for 3 years. And so if you look at it from the perspective of net new, and I'm just deciding whether I want to put this in my EA or I want to do this through the service provider, is definitely more cost effective for 3 years to do that through the service provider, because it's 33 versus 41,000. If I take that out over 6 years and go into the SA renewal cycle on that server, it's, you know, 17,000 a year. So another, you know, what's that? 3 times 17, I can't do that math today, $51,000 or $53,000 or so. So 6 years on an EA, so go through 1 net new cycle, and an SA cycle is $94,000 versus 6 years on SPLA would be $67,000. So the only scenario from a dollar perspective where this makes sense is if I have SA only on those SQL licenses, because it's $17,000 for 3 years versus you know, $33,000. So you really need to think through what the scenario is, because you can see net new servers moving over. I got to buy LNSA for those. The SPLA licenses may be easier for me to manage or more cost effective. If I've got SA only on it, it may be more cost effective, but if I can repurpose those and not have to do true ups, the net new scenario basically holds true here, right? So you really have to think through, what is that workload? What are we moving? What licenses do we currently have? What are we paying? Are we anticipating any true ups, or are those going to shrink? Because if they're going to shrink, maybe we'll just move the licenses over with them. But if we're going to anticipate some growth on premise still, maybe it's not wise to take our own licenses. And so that's why I say you got to think about the reps comp plan before you buy, because I'm working with one client right now where they're being pushed to, they're looking to move to the cloud, and they haven't picked what provider they're going to yet. But Microsoft is pushing them to move all their SQL licenses into LNSA, where they don't have all of them on that today, so that they get the license mobility right. And when I run the numbers with them and show them, look, if those workloads are that you own licenses for today, that just older licenses, SQL 2008 or whatnot, when you move those to the cloud provider, 6 years, you're in better shape than rebuying them, buying net new now. It changed the conversation with Microsoft quite a bit, as you can imagine. So you really want to think through these things, look at them, try and figure out, okay, what is it that's going on, okay? Because you really almost have to go workload by workload and look at it and go, what licenses do I have? What am I moving to the cloud? What licenses can I take? Does it include license mobility? Do I have software assurance on the server licenses themselves? If it's a product that's licensed server cal, do I have SA on the cals as well? And can I move those over? And what's the impact to Windows Server? Okay, so this is complicated. It's not straightforward. It's something that you got to think through. You have to look at your entire environment, try and figure out how best to utilize those licenses and move them out. But you really do need to think through workload by workload. Am I moving it, and does it make sense to license with mobility? Because in that scenario where it's SA only and we're not growing, absolutely move your SQL licenses to the cloud provider, right? Why wouldn't you? It's cheaper to maintain those than to pay, in this case, $17,000 for 3 years versus $33,000 for the service provider to buy those. But if I got to go and do a bunch of true ups, I would have been better to use those licenses against my net new licenses and doing true ups, and then letting the service provider deal with licenses. And that in itself may be a benefit to you as an organization, not having to worry about the licenses for this stuff and putting the burden of managing that license complexity onto the service provider themselves. So I'm going to go through this again. I know I've covered this, but I'm going to go through again what's the criteria to use license mobility, because this is where you always have to start, right? So first thing is it must have active software assurance. And it also has to maintain active software assurance for the amount of time that you're using it at the service provider. I had one client say, okay, well, my EA is up in a year. I plan on putting this over to Amazon. I'm going to run it over there for 4 years. I'm not going to renew SA. No, you can't do that. If you're going to use those licenses, it needs to have active SA for the 4 years. Okay, so it has to have active SA, and it needs to continue to have active SA. It must meet the eligibility for license mobility, so that's Section 4, software assurance under the product and the product terms, in order to qualify. If it's not covered, if it says no, it's not covered, check the product terms under the SA benefit section. So I think it's Appendix B in the product terms. There's an SA benefit section, and some of them have some exceptions in there. So Windows says no, but when you go and check, SA benefits section B, if it's moving to Azure, the answer is yes. And so it's got some restricted ones. So always just double check. There may be something hidden down there that you didn't anticipate that you can use. So don't forget, the Windows Server OS doesn't qualify, so you can't take that to a third party, with the exception of that new Azure mobility benefit, so you could take it to Azure. If the product is licensed with server and cal, you need to make sure that not just the server licenses, but all our cals are covered with software assurance as well. And by the way, that one usually blows the case out of the water for moving SA to a third-party service provider. Now, it gets complicated, right? Because let's say I don't want to take Exchange to Office 365. I want to go to a third party and have them host my Exchange. So I can do that. Lots of third parties out there that do hosted Exchange. I can do server mobility. Now, if I've got a core cal or an eCal in my enterprise agreement that has SA already included, that's great. If I'm an organization that doesn't have those, I'm probably better to buy those licenses through the service provider themselves, through their SPLA agreement, versus buying those things net new. So again, there's no real, I wish I could create a decision tree that just kind of says, if this, do this, if this, do this. You almost have to look at it instance by instance, okay? Now, here's a key one that, I know AWS can do. I know Azure you can do this with. I know DataPipe you can do this with. But some of the bigger third parties, I don't know that they can do it, is they do have a provision in there that says it has to be contained within a single cloud server farm within Azure or the service provider. Okay, so in other words, the service provider can reassign the licenses within that single farm, which is limited to 2 data centers within a geographical boundary as defined in the product terms. Okay, so if you've got a service provider with data centers, across the country or all over the globe, and potentially these things are moving around, you may break the license mobility rules by having them, if they move them and you don't have any controls on that. So it is just something, I don't think, technically this is something that would happen all that often, but it's just something to tuck in the back of your mind. And the reason for that is the 90-day rule applies. So if you move it from one host to another, or, the 90-day rule applies in the following manner. You move it within a server farm within the data center, it's now stuck in that other server farm for 90 days. Same thing, if you move your licenses to a third party, they're stuck at the third party for 90 days. So here's a use case that we run into in cloud that, this would not work for this scenario. Quarter end or year end reporting, need some more servers to do some compute for all the crunching that goes on in the annual reports or whatnot. Let's just, instead of bringing in more servers, we're going to do a hybrid cloud environment where we're going to rent some servers from AWS for 30 or 60 days to get some more compute and cycle process and be able to handle the data. Well, you can't really do server or license mobility there, because if it's only for 30 or 60 days, your licenses are tied over there for 90. And so that scenario may not work. You'd have to have some excess licenses and things like that, but it's likely that model doesn't work there. And so that is a use case scenario that we see quite frequently, just renting some temporary space to run some projects or whatnot. And license mobility may not work in those scenarios. Now, the biggest thing is you need to complete the license verification process. And that in itself is a little bit of an ugly process. I mean, Microsoft literally has a 9-page license verification guide, which I've put the link to in the deck, so if you ask for the deck, you'll get it. But if you look on the right, there's what you're going to end up filling out. That looks an awful lot like an amendment that goes in your contract. And so you actually have to go through the volume license, assign the licenses to the license mobility, fill out these forms, and submit them to Microsoft. So if you think about, potentially the number of, the movement of, the changes in, this could become a cumbersome process, because if let's say you put it up, it's up there for 90 days, you bring it back down, put it back up 90 days later, you got to go and refill out this paperwork. If you don't forget to do it, Microsoft could potentially call you non-compliant because you didn't fill it out. They could call your service provider non-compliant because they didn't get the paperwork, and if your service provider gets audited, they may push that down to you. So you can see the complication of this whole process. So this in itself, the cumbersome nature of Microsoft's reporting process that they want here, may be all in all a reason when you look at the cost not to do license mobility. And like I said, I'm not pushing one way or the other, but I just don't really see the big benefit of it when you can make it simpler just by buying the licenses from the partner. Now, if you are looking for a partner, here's a link here where you can go to as well that has all the eligible license mobility partners. Now, the big guys are all there. Okay, so the big, data service providers are all in this program. But if you do have a smaller regional data center that you use for third party, they may not be certified because it is a bit of a process. So you want to double check that you can even use them, because even though your server licenses and have license mobility, if the service provider that you're going to isn't a partner, you can't use them, right? So that's another thing that you have to think through. I actually ran into this with a large organization. They had a small regional player that had a couple of data centers in their town or their city. They moved some workloads over there, thought they could use their licenses, and lo and behold, they weren't a server like license mobility partner from Microsoft, and these guys found themselves in a little bit of trouble, right? So you have to check that out as well. I talked about the 90-day rule. I'm not going to go back into that, but basically just put that in there as a refresher. It's really where the licenses can move, but they're tied to the new server for 90 days, and then they can't transfer back unless the SA lets them. That's where the license mobility comes in. Same process applies to third-party data centers, except for you can't transfer them for 90 days again, even if they do have license mobility. Okay, and so that's, I think there may have been some questions that I saw. So Sean, I'm going to open it up here in 2 seconds to some questions. Like I said, I know this is a complicated conversation or topic today. Kind of, hit on it at a real high level. We'll probably do some further sessions on cloud mobility, where I think what I'll do is actually just poll and do, examples of different things that people are doing and explaining, here's how we would look at it and here's how they would license it and things like that. But I do have a small favor to ask. If you're one of our regular attendees, if there's a topic, or even if it's the first one, if there's a topic you'd like me to see me discuss on a future webinar, drop me an email, mike@method180.com. I'm always wanting to make sure that everybody gets value out of attending these. So if there's something you'd like to see, just drop me an email and I'll see if I can get it into the schedule. And then the other thing that we are offering is we do a cloud licensing business case for clients. We usually charge about $9,500 for that. If you've attended the webinar, for $5,000, if you want us to come in and take a look at a cloud workload that you're looking to migrate to the cloud, we'll look at the license analysis and tell you what's the best licensing vehicle for you to do that based on the licenses that you have and what options there are. What I will say is these assessments very easily pay for themselves. And literally all we need to do is find one SQL license that can be repurposed, and the value of these things pay for themselves. So if you're looking for looking at moving some workloads, we're happy to take a look. You can send an email to sales@method180.com. And Sean, you want to maybe run through the questions that came up? And
yeah, absolutely. We've got a couple of questions. I see a few more people are just submitting, so I'll just give people another moment to submit via the chat console. While we're just waiting for those to come in, I'm just going to take this opportunity just to mention our next webinar is going to be on June 2nd at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We're taking a bit of a different approach with this one, in that we're having kind of an Ask the Experts about software audits. Is going to be the way the webinar flows. And what we've decided to do is bring together a series of rock stars from various, I would say, roles within the software licensing community. So Mike is obviously going to be on the panel. He's going to be representing Microsoft licensing. We're bringing in Ed Ramirez from SLC, who's going to be representing Oracle licensing expertise. Dean Williams from Block 64 has a deep background in various software asset management tools, so he's going to cover off that side. And rounding out our panel will be Michael Shaw from the Sourcing Source, who functions really as kind of an advocate for the procurement community as a whole. So we think we cover off all the bases. It should be a lot of fun, so look forward to getting an invitation from us to this event. So Mike, we do have a few questions that have now come in. I've got a question from Dave, which is, Mike, in your opinion, why would they differentiate the OS for license mobility?
There's probably a logical reason for that, and I'm kind of choking a little bit because, if you're working at Microsoft, or if you've been around Microsoft for quite some time, you'll notice that the Windows and the SQL Server product group always do the, complete opposite. SQL went with cores, Windows went with processors, although they're changing that. SQL has license mobility, therefore Windows doesn't. And it could be as silly as that, where the Windows product group, the SQL product group decided they were going to have it, and the Windows product group was like, there's no way we're going to have it. I can't think of any other reasonable reason for Windows not to be on there, other than, the product group itself just is refusing for whatever reason to allow them to do it. But, it is something that makes it complicated, because even if you are doing license mobility, you now got a second license model that you need to make sure is taken care of, although the burden for that is on the service provider. But it could be that. If I want to look at it from the perspective of trying not to be cynical with them, most of those third-party data centers in their, called multi-tenant environments are licensing with data center, where they get unlimited virtualization anyways. So it probably is a lot more cost-effective to utilize their licenses, because a lot of the times, they've figured out ways to get a lot of VMs on, a couple of processors and whatnot. So the cost to do that through data center is probably, beneficial. So, maybe the Windows team has thought of it that way. I don't know, but that would be, if I was looking at it through their lens, that might be why. But it could also just be that, SQL decided to do this and the Windows product group didn't want to. So.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I've got another question, and that is, do you find that Microsoft assumes that the client may not be familiar with all these nuances?
Absolutely. They actually hope you don't, and that's why they run all these SAM engagements and audits or audits. They make licensing is complicated, and they basically operate from the premise that you don't know how to license. Now, I would turn that and say 90% of their field sales force doesn't know how to license either, and that's even more dangerous. But yeah, no, they absolutely assume you don't know it. In fact, when you do know it, when clients work with us and we run through these things and we put together and we get them to the point where they fully understand and are clear on what their license requirements are, and they go to Microsoft and they say, here's what we're doing and this is why. And Microsoft says, let's have a meeting, and then they get in a room and have a meeting, and it's just, basically crickets chirping because they don't have any defense to it. So, yeah, no, you should absolutely assume that they assume you don't understand these nuances, and I think it's truly important that you do understand them so that you're not overpaying. Right? Or if you are overpaying, use it as leverage in your negotiation with them. They want you to do license mobility, and you have licenses, that's great. But if you can look at your workloads and go, geez, it's, for the next year, 50% cheaper to do these through AWS licensing than yours, Microsoft make that right. You want that account team make that right. So you can, use it as leverage in a negotiation as well.
Okay, great. And I think I have one question of my own, but unless there's any more coming in, I'll just ask my question, and then we'll see if there's any other questions that come in. And that's, Mike, when you're moving to one of these hosted clouds, one thing I always get confused on is what happens to my existing perpetual license rights when I make this sort of transition? Do I retain those?
Yeah, so you do, and you still maintain, the software assurance rights to the version upgrades or, whatever else are there. So you do maintain those. The way that I think about it, and I always try and boil these things down into simple. So if you look at that scenario I used, that was simple. It was one SQL server, right? Well, an application may have 10, and you want to move all 10, and so that gets a little bit complicated. But if you think about it from a simple perspective, all you're doing is you're just putting servers in a different data center, right? And so most organizations have more than one data center. It's just you need to be able to manage the inventory in that data center to look at your licenses to make sure you're able to use, you're properly licensed for your use in that other data center. Just because it's not yours, doesn't really mean much, other than Microsoft has a bunch of rules around what you can and can't do over there. So, you want to know what's over there. You want to know how that's being inventoried, because at the end of the day, that's your responsibility. And I think this is a key point, because I see this all the time in my engagements. People, are outsourced, have things in third-party data centers, and they're like, wow, the third party is responsible for that. Well, no, you're responsible for that. They may be responsible for the licenses, but you're going to be responsible and asked by Microsoft in an audit or SAM engagement to show that you're appropriately licensed. So even if those are SPLA licenses through the service provider, you need to be able to show that stuff. And so, you don't wash your hands of it. Oh, geez, we put it over into AWS. Let's not worry about it, right? Okay, no, it's in AWS. These servers are in. We bought the licenses through AWS. Here's our receipts, and keep the records so that you don't run into those problems.
Okay, great, Mike. I think we've kind of wrapped up all the questions for today. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for the presentation. I think on the screen now we've got how you can reach Mike and Method 180 if there's anything we can do for you. We'll be sending out a copy of this recording as well as links to the slide deck and the special offer that Mike made around the providing a bit of analysis for cloud workloads. We'll be sending that out in the next, I say, 24 to 48 hours. But thank you again for joining us. Mike, did you have anything you wanted to say to wrap up?
No, I think that's great. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.